welcome into Inside 44 with Alex Alexandrou. My name is John Global Communications Manager here at the City of Aurora, Illinois. And today, as you can see, we have another roundtable here to talk about a very important topic in the City of Aurora, in the state of Illinois and beyond, TIFs, Tax Increment Financing. What is it? How does it affect you as a resident? And what's all behind the TIF process? We're going to break it all down and have a really fun discussion here today. Of course, first, the namesake of the program's here with me. He is the Chief Management Officer for the City of Aurora. He's a 25-year City of Aurora veteran, Alex Alexandrou. Alex, great to see you as always.
Always great to be with you, John.
And a special guest here with us, too. He is from the village of Lombard. He is the village of Lombard's village manager and formerly the village manager of Tinley Park, my hometown. I'm biased already. Scott Niehaus is here. Scott, great to see you, too.
Thanks for having me, John and Alex, and I look forward to talking TIF with you, too.
Thank you, and thanks for being here, Scott. You know, it was 2 years ago at our Illinois Municipal League annual conference that Scott and a very renowned attorney put on, and I think Scott's going to give us a little more background on that, put on an absolutely terrific presentation, basically debunking the myths about TIFs, because there is a lot, and has been historically, a lot of misunderstanding and sometimes some misinformation about TIFs. And so we hope today to not just debunk, but provide some real common sense explanations of what the TIF Act and the TIF law really means and what it's meant to our two communities as well as the state of Illinois.
Sure, Alex, that's a good segue. Just a little bit about the origin on that. I'm a member of the Illinois Municipal League's Managers Committee, and a couple of years ago, a request was made by the IML board to have the managers work on an information packet that could be provided to municipalities and mayors across the state who were considering TIFs or had questions. So that presentation came from that request and is now something that's distributed statewide. A couple of nuggets that we learned along the way. Within the state of Illinois, there's approximately 1,400 active TIF districts, which makes it a very common, almost run-of-the-mill kind of program with very specific rules and processes to follow. And even with those 1,400 TIF districts, that space only represents about 5% of the total taxable area within the state of Illinois.
So 95% of what's out there in terms of development is not TIFed, or it's not part of a TIF district.
That's correct.
So that's pretty significant because, again, I think people misunderstand the application of it and believe that it's one like an automatic tool that we always use, which is clearly not the case. And we know there are significant parameters to the TIF Act and a number of steps or processes that we have to go through before we can even get a TIF established, correct?
Correct. And you might hear the term but for. If there's a good piece of property that's empty cornfield development and has no environmental problems, no infrastructure problems, generally it's not going to meet the standard for a TIF. But a lot of times you have properties that might not have potable water. They might have a 100-year-old building that's obsolete and has asbestos that has to be removed. These things are impediments to normal development, and the but-for theory states that but for government assistance, the project wouldn't happen. And I think in most times, if you're looking at, say, in Lombard, a vacant Carson Peary Scott of 200,000 square feet, most citizens don't want to see that remain dark. And that's why sometimes a TIF is justified to help address the redevelopment opportunities.
So 2 points to those were great examples. So the cornfield and the 100-year-old building in its present state without any further assistance or development really is not generating any, if maybe very little, tax revenue for all the taxing districts, correct?
Correct. The Carson Peary Scott about 5 years ago hit its nadir in terms of its historical assessed
That's a great
valuation.
word, by the way.
I read it in a book one time. I tried to remember that, Alex.
So but the point is, we, without or but for that intervention, those would continue to not contribute anything, very little, negligently, a negligent amount to the taxing
I'll
district.
go a step further. Not just that PIN number,
Right.
but a property that remains vacant for 10 years starts to erode at the property value on the house across the street.
Great point.
Or the property across the street. So what you would see is a general sagging of EAVs on the properties adjacent to a blighted property.
And then I think the other significant misnomer is that this is taking away revenue, existing revenue that taxing districts are getting. And I know one of the portions of the law is really that this utilizes future tax revenues that do not exist in the present state that the property might be in pre-development. Is that a fair
Correct.
statement?
Alex and John, I'll be the first to admit, I'm not really strong in math.
Right.
But I had a couple of notes written down on a property that philosophically was worth $100. If the annual tax bill on that $100 property was $10 and you created a TIF, that $10 that's collected from that property stays with all of the taxing districts that it already goes to. If a TIF is enacted, government intervention takes place, and that property is worth $200 and the taxes go to $20, the only amount that goes back into the TIF is the second $10. The
Right, not
first
the full
$10 goes to where it was always going. And then the municipality that collects that increment, they cannot spend it on police. They cannot spend it on fire. They cannot spend it on public works. They have to spend that $10 back in the geographic district where it was created.
In the TIF district.
In the TIF district.
Correct. So it's a reinvestment tool, really.
And not a general revenue fund.
Correct. Correct. That's a great point.
At the end of the day, really, what's going on in that sort of a situation, if we go back to that example, over time, you're going to be doubling the tax revenue that existed in that district due to TIF over time.
If you're properly using the TIF and you're benefiting it so that it becomes worth more money.
So it's really a long play or a long game situation, right? You're doing it to take something to build up that increment over the 23-year period, but it will continue to pay well beyond. So after the 23 years, the disbursement to the districts will be significantly higher than what it was at the beginning.
Yeah, again, using my poor math on that $100 and 10 to something that becomes $200 and pays 20. When the TIF expires, then the full $20 is going to all the other taxing districts, which is double what was going there before.
And I don't know about Lombard, but in Aurora, we've done some TIFs over the years that we do distribute some percentage of funds back during the 23-year. And again, that's all negotiable based on the deal and the math. So it's not like we have done TIFs, and I think you may have done this too in Lombard. So there's this straight, okay, there's no distribution of the increment until the TIF expires, but there's also another model that's legal, that's allowed, that a percentage can be distributed along the way.
Absolutely. That is an example that we have used in Lombard in a downtown TIF. It was actually one of the first TIF districts ever created, and it made it through its 23-year run. And everything in the TIF district had been redeveloped, save one property. For anybody that's familiar with Lombard, there was this building called the DuPage Theater right in the downtown. That was the last remaining property that hadn't been really redeveloped. So the village of Lombard went to the state legislature and went to the local school districts and park districts and sought to extend that TIF from 23 years to 35 years, which you can add 12 years. And the arrangement we made and the agreement that came to fruition was for all the property that had been redeveloped, 90% of the incremental growth would be turned over to all the other taxing districts for that last 12 years. So essentially, those districts got everything that they had coming to them, but we needed to preserve the full benefit of the TIF to address the DuPage Theater property, which as we sit here today is now a fully leased 120-unit apartment building with a 3,500 square foot restaurant and an adjacent 10,000 square foot building that's fully leased and adding to the resurgence of our downtown.
Fantastic. That's great. And we've got examples too. Our outlet mall, the Chicago Premium Outlet Mall, probably one of the most successful TIFs in the state, if not the country. Also, what we're doing out at Fox Valley Mall with the conversion of the mall to a lifestyle center, because we too had these large vacant boxes of the old Carsons there and the old Sears, and now they're going like gangbusters. But we negotiated with the school district there, and we reached an agreement and avoided any litigation, and now the area is flourishing. And not just, like you said, not just the subject property, but values are rising all around. We've also done in the past 6 or 7 years, we've used micro TIFs strategically, like in our downtown, so that we limited the increment creation and the effect on a school district, for example, or other taxing bodies. And that has proven very successful for us as well. I don't know if you've done that.
We've done a couple of them. Not to get too far into the weeds, but Lombard is a non-home rule community.
Okay, and we're home rule, right?
And the idea of a nice micro TIF is it's specific to one property.
Right.
You can get in there, and if the property's redeveloped and it's everything you wanted it to be after 5, 6, or 7 years, you can end it. We've done some similar things like that without calling it a TIF, but a 10-year deal where the other taxing districts rebate a portion of the property tax for 10 years. For example, we had a vacant Kmart building, if you can remember that. John might not know what a Kmart building is. I've never shopped there.
He only knows Walmart.
Alex and I can probably talk about Venture and Zare as well, but we had a vacant
I think
Kmart.
I have something on layaway still at Venture. Never picked it up.
We had a vacant Kmart that sat vacant for 13 years.
Wow.
And we used a micro TIF kind of concept, and now it's a Mariano's on that corner. It's one of the most successful projects that I've personally been involved with in Lombard.
And so let's talk a little bit about, this is not a very, we're trying to keep this as simple an explanation as possible, but this is a complicated act at times. There are a number, I think I counted over 20 specific steps that we have to go through. Talk a little bit about, and especially with the great work that IML and our DuPage mayor, you and I serve on the board and on managers and the board, how much the work that you did and the managers did to help explain this in very straightforward terms. But talk about the process for folks listening, because it's complicated, but it involves a lot of public notice, for example. So talk a little bit about the process.
I'd say the thing that is probably most valuable is to talk about a required body that gets assigned to every TIF. It's called the Joint Review Board, or JRB. It is not a kitchen cabinet stacked by the local government. Statutorily, a Joint Review Board has to have specific representation and inclusion of other taxing districts. It has to have a citizen appointee. And beyond being appointed at the creation of the TIF, there is an annual meeting required every year where the Joint Review Board is allowed to sit down and understand what is happening in the TIF. And audited financial statements are provided to be filed with the state, which indicates the funding that's coming in and how it's being spent. The local government needs to adopt a formal budget for the TIF, and they have to live within those projected budgets. If they choose to change those budgets, that is a public process. So this is something that is done in the light of day, and there's an annual accountability associated with it.
And the JRB is towards the latter portion of the process, correct? So prior to establishment of a JRB, some of those things are already done. In other words, the eligibility for the whole project has been established, budgets and design and work with the developer. So there's a lot that goes in ahead of that. But the JRB to me is almost like a culmination of the process, because once it goes to the JRB and gets approved, then you're off
and running.
Correct.
And that's a good point, Alex. You bring up the confirmation of some existing conditions. According to the state statute, there's 14 different conditions that are out there. And in order for a TIF to be approved, at least 5 of those conditions must be met. And some of the conditions I'm more familiar with in my history would include things like environmental cleanup. I mentioned it before. Asbestos is an impediment to redevelopment. You can have a situation called blight, where generally within a district, if you have 20 properties and 17 of them are in some form of disrepair, that would meet a standard of blight. There's another big word that I learned at one time called obsolescence. What does that mean? In 1971, when Yorktown Mall was built, the idea of a 180,000 square foot anchor store was not obsolete. People shopped in that. But a 180,000 square foot anchor store is obsolete today because of internet purchases, the way that we shop and consume things. So that building, while it still had good bones, is now obsolete. Stormwater. Another condition might be multiple property owners. It's real easy to do a deal if John Doe owns the property and you're just talking to that person. But if you're in a downtown area with 27 different property owners, that in itself is an impediment to development. So a government has to check the box and factually confirm that 5 of those 14 factors are met. And if you can't meet that, no TIF.
So that's the minimum is 5. So it's really a case-by-case scenario using these 14 criteria as your requirements, right? That you have to meet at least 5 of them. And so that's quite a burden. And I believe, at least in my experience with our economic development folks over the years, we make that determination fairly early on, because it's in some cases very obvious that this won't qualify for a TIF. But in other cases, again, using those guidelines, you're checking the boxes and you're at 5, 6, 7 items, it's definitely TIF. And so we then work the deal differently, right, from a funding perspective, if it's TIF eligible or not. And with the City of Aurora, as you know, I mean, you were down here today. You see we've got some beautiful historic buildings. We've made every attempt to preserve many of them, but historic buildings are not easy to repurpose. They're complicated at times. You might have historic conditions, asbestos and like, but then when you get into the use of historic tax credits, which could be a whole nother podcast, you've got to find the way to create this increment so that these significant expenses can be paid for. Again, deal by deal. We've had to do some of the what we've done with the casino, for example, or some of our older buildings downtown. We had to put in some level, but at each scenario, they're either repayable loans at some point, or they are fully guaranteed by the developer. For example, the casino, the bond that the city put in of the overall $360 million, the $50 million bond, fully guaranteed by the casino, as well as the property tax. There's a floor that if it falls below that, they make up the difference repaying. So that's not our first choice. But again, as we said at the onset, TIF is a tool. There's different ways to use that tool. There's different options. And I think all of them basically are creating something out of nothing. A blighted property, a vacant property, all the properties that have these different conditions that, but for implementation of the TIF, would not create that increment over 23 years that will ultimately benefit all the taxing bodies, not just the city.
Agree.
And from a from a long-term play, as we talked about a little bit earlier, I mean, think about the redevelopment, at least in Aurora specifically. You think about the casino and what used to be on that property before we started building the casino. We think about downtown, the Hobbs building, for example. It was told that it should be demolished at one point, and now it's a thriving building. That's due to TIF, right? That's due to using an economic development tool to then, instead of tear down a building or have something there that was not generating any money, to generate more money over time and bring better quality of life to the residents.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, you have to start with a viable, experienced developer or an interested party, right? But then if you think about all your examples, across where the casino is going now, those were two, I'm going to call them obsolete hotels that had created a lot of public safety issues. They were in really bad shape, and they're at a gateway to one of our key gateways to our community, across from the Chicago Premium Outlet Mall that draws 8 million people a year, right off the expressway. The Hobbs building, people may remember this, we had to shut down a portion of River Street and a lane on Galena and get in and get an emergency order to stabilize the Onion Dome because it was ready to collapse. And we had folks who were saying, tear it down. Don't put the money into it. The Bloomhaven, the Old Copley Hospital, another massive example where some in the community were calling for its demolition. The Hobbs building right now has 2, soon to be 3 thriving restaurants. The apartments, the historic apartments are full. Bloomhaven is doing very, very well between the Weston Bridges and the side for persons with disabilities. The bakery that's in the old 1888 original hospital, people love. And School District 131 thriving in their new consolidated headquarters that they never had before. And to Scott's great point earlier, Bloomhaven, I think, is probably the best example in the middle of a historic neighborhood where that became the rising tide that has raised all boats. And you see people reinvesting in their homes. Safety is up, crime is down. There's a beautiful park associated with Bloomhaven. So all that came because we strategically used TIF as a tool, and the value of that entire area has gone up and will continue to go up.
And I'd like to add, for those maybe at home who still don't really understand the but-for purpose, those are some key examples. You can look at buildings, see how they look before, see how they look after TIF, and say, there's the but-for. There's the government stepping in and doing something to help these buildings kind of regain their old lost glory.
Yeah, and John, I just want to piggyback on something you said for those at home. One of the most critical residents in Lombard that I've come across, her name is Ruth Niehaus, my mom. I've had this discussion about TIF with her. So there are people in every town USA, they see an acronym like TIF. That's what my mom calls it. What's TIF, not TIF? It is confusing. It's okay to ask questions, but this is what's kind of neat about this kind of a format is Alex and I can have this conversation on the street corner and probably go all night and put on a pot of coffee. And not everybody's going to want to listen to us. But sometimes it does take having to talk to that citizen about it. And one other thing that really gets confusing, in DuPage County, the day that the tax bills come out is April 30th, right? For some people, their blood boils that day, right? And they look at this tax bill in the great state of Illinois that has 13 different taxing agencies. So then they also happen to see on the tax bill the format that says TIF District. And they think that is an added tax. It is not.
Right.
And this is a real important point to get across for those of you at home. The taxes that, if they live or own property in a TIF, it's the same amount of taxes that would be levied without a TIF. The only thing is, it is an itemized line item, so you can know how much of it is going to the municipal government to be reinvested in that TIF. So if we go back to this $10 and $20 example, and your property's increased in value to $200, you would see a $10 levy that's going to all the other taxing districts. And then you would see a $10 levy that goes to the TIF district. But you can rest assured that that money is going to pay for a brick in the sidewalk or something else happening. And it's not finding its way out of the TIF for some other purpose. And that's why I wish we could go door to door and talk to everybody and get down to this level, but we just can't.
But for example, there are a lot of folks out there who say the TIF created here in Aurora or there in Aurora is actually taking revenue away from, say, the local school district. And that's just not true. It didn't exist to begin with, pre-TIF, because the property in question was paying next to nothing because it was either blighted or underdeveloped or simply vacant, right? But I believe the TIF Act requires that level of transparency, right?
That's why the
That
tax
it's
bill
shown-
is that way.
Correct. So people see something on a tax bill, they automatically assume it's a tax, and it's not. And I wish sometimes we could explain, maybe we're not explaining it right to people, that your tax bill contains a number of different independent taxing bodies. The Village of Lombard, the City of Aurora, we're but one of a number of them. And I know in some areas in Illinois, I remember talking to someone we had used as an expert in an arbitration, and he described mosquito abatement districts and some very particular districts, all of whom by law can be created in Illinois, and all of whom have taxing power. So we can control, Scott and I, we don't individually, personally, the collective we in our towns, we control the extent of our taxes, right? And what we, but
In Lombard, we're about 8% of the tax bill. My guess is Aurora is very similar.
yeah.
So for every $1 that somebody pays in property taxes, about 8 cents rolls our way.
But the use of TIFs in no way increases the tax or takes anything away.
I agree.
Very, very astute points here. I do want to get to, as we kind of get near the end of this TIF episode, I want to talk to both of you for a minute about leadership as well. You know, we have our chief management officer here. We have a village manager here. And these are two high-level chief executives, if you will, of the respective villages and cities. So having two people like this in the same room, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about leadership and talk about what it takes to lead a city, what it takes to lead a village, and all the hours you guys put in to help the villages and cities that you represent flourish and blossom, if you will. So I do want to start with this, and I'll ask you, Alex, and then Scott, I'll come to you. What's the art of managing a city, managing people, doing your best to put your best foot forward for Aurora?
I think like anything else, you have to set the example for people. And, you know, I've been in a number of different roles for multiple administrations for the last 25 years. And I've tried to stay consistent in listening to employees. You know, we're a heavily unionized workforce. We got some incredible people that do the day-to-day work that sometimes goes unnoticed. And so we've tried, at least since 2017, since I've been in this position, to try and highlight and support those frontline employees. And I've done it really having my door always open, always trying to be accessible, and setting that standard. You know, I like to diffuse tense situations sometimes with a little humor to get people to relax. You know, there's an old Greek expression, if you're not laughing, you're crying. So what would you rather do? But, it's been a tremendous honor working for the city. And I also get to work with great professionals like Scott and others, either through IML or through our DuPage mayor and managers, the Council of Government, because people also forget Aurora's in 4 different counties. We have a significant portion of Aurora in DuPage County. We've got some great businesses in DuPage County. And so my job partly is to try and give as much equal time around the city as I can, supporting the mayor, supporting the city council. But that takes a lot of time and effort. And we don't just shut it down at 5 p.m. In fact, at my house, my kids used to take bets if Dad was going to be on the phone or not coming in from the garage. I've never seen how much they've actually made off these bets, or if they're actually anything's happening there. But there's a lot involved. But I would have it no other way. It's the career that I chose, and I'm not the traditional. I didn't go the traditional route, but I've got a ton of respect for my colleagues at DuPage Mayor and Managers and Metro West and IML. So, and just shout out to Scott again. After seeing 2 years ago the presentation that Scott and was it Herb? What was the attorney's name?
Herb and Steve Klein.
Yeah, the Herb and Steve Klein put on. It really was a game changer. It was a packed house, and it's the work that continues to benefit from a communication standpoint. Every manager, every municipality that's had the good fortune to try and educate folks. And it's not just our residents. Our staff really has appreciated the people that work on our deals in economic development really have appreciated the clarity with which the presentation, and I know we're going to be throughout the discussion here putting in some of the slides. And, I really encourage people to follow that because it's straightforward. It debunks any of the myths out there, and it's based on the truth, data, and evidence.
I'll try to wrap it up for you because I know we're short on time. Bringing it back full circle, the presentation that I spoke about was generated by IML for the purposes of getting it to the general public. So this presentation that was given to the mayors and managers is a public document, and you may want to consider putting that link into there because that's the intent, is to get it in people's hands.
Absolutely.
And then to your question, John, I'm German, Alex. I generally didn't grow up in a house where I laughed or cried, but I've definitely done that in my career, and I found that to be helpful. And John used a really good word. What is the art form of being a manager? Historically, in the 50s and 60s, city managers were engineers. It was all about building roads and building sewers and pipes. Today's manager needs to be a lot more fluid or artistic. I came the traditional route, undergrad degree, graduate degree, internship, but I wasn't prepared for pandemics, international global issues, 9/11. These are all things I've seen in my career, and I do think it's an art form. So I appreciate you using that word. And then, since I did call my mom the most critical resident of Lombard, I'll just say this. She gave me some good advice that I take with me every day. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen more, talk less.
Love it.
Perfect way to end
Great advice.
today's discussion. Scott Niehaus, Alex Alexandrou, thank you both for joining us here today on Inside 44 with Alex Alexandrou. Until next time, so long, Aurora.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.